So we're gonna stick with the Nintendo 64 theme going into this week as we take a look at what many pretty much regard as like the holy grail of Nintendo 64 collecting, especially when it comes to accessories or systems, and that is the 64DD, or the 64 disk drive, or the 64 dynamic drive. Yes, we're gonna be looking at this today. It's a really interesting and ambitious failure from Nintendo, as it was only really on the market for over a year or so, like a year and a half, but it had been in planning since before the 64 even came out. That's right, this was introduced around the time that the 64 was being previewed and demoed, and was supposed to have come out closer to the 64 launch, but didn't even come out until 1999, only in Japan, and then later discontinued in 2001. So it wasn't around for very long, which is probably why it's become so rare online. I picked this up a little over a year ago, and since then it has already doubled in value and pricing online. Not only that, I actually got about 5 games with it, so we have quite a bit to look at here, and yes, don't worry, we'll also take it apart. So do me a favor, guys, and if you enjoy the video, hit that like button to help out, and let's go over what the 64DD was supposed to be. It was kind of Nintendo's answer to what Sony was doing with their CDs. See, the idea here is Nintendo wanted a way to create larger games without the larger budget that came with it. Now, 64 cartridges could hold anywhere from 8 megabytes up to 64 megabytes. The only problem is the 64 megabyte cartridges were very, very expensive. There were only a few games that actually even touched that capacity. Games like Conker's Bad Fur Day, Pokemon Stadium 2, Resident Evil 2, and strangely, the European version of Paper Mario, which apparently the reason for that is because it had several different languages included, so naturally graphics and text would also be included. I believe the American version was about 40 megabytes, but going over to Europe with all the extra stuff included bumped it up to 64. And that's where these came in. These were basically what we would use in our zip drives back in the day. Now, most people probably don't know about zip drives, so we can go back a little further and talk about floppy disks, because I'm sure even if you're a little younger, you may have seen these online or had someone talk to you about them before. But floppy disks was a way for us to pretty much transfer data or install Windows, which would take like 12 or 13 of them, but they didn't hold a lot of memory at the time. I think most floppies held like just over a megabyte or something. It wasn't a ton then, but then we went up to zip drives where we had these guys basically, and it was a larger capacity without having to go up to CDs. Now, eventually CDs came out and these just went away. These became obsolete very, very quickly. But Nintendo decided to use these because, of course, it's more durable than a CD, and these were able to hold the 64 megabytes that they were looking to do without spending an arm and a leg for it. And these were kind of in between. So you had the 64 cartridge that would read very, very fast, right? Very rarely would you even notice a load time with a cartridge. It was pretty much instant. Now, you would have times where it still had to load information into memory, and you might see like a fade to black and then come back, something like that, but you didn't get the bar of loading, we would say, for the PlayStation 1 games. These still had to load, but they were faster than PlayStation 1 CDs. They were roughly, I'd say, for reading data, about 3 times as fast as a PlayStation 1 disc, but of course, significantly slower than a cartridge. They were also much more durable because while inside is a very fragile disc, of course, kind of the floppy disk, it was encased in plastic, and it was pretty difficult, of course, to even take a look at it, and it had this little locking mechanism that you could push down, but you weren't really doing that on accident. You had to really go looking to do it. And that was pretty much Nintendo's idea, something that was durable, but would still allow them to hold more information at a cheaper rate with minimal loading times. And it was pretty easy to use. You would take it, you would just pop it in here, and at that point, you were good to go. And to eject it, you had a little button here that would kick it right out. It's very mechanical in feeling, it really does. Like, you can feel it just kind of have this big click in and then it kicks it right out. Now the way this worked is you took your 64, you dropped it right on the 64DD. It's not region locked or anything, so if you end up getting one from Japan, it will work with your American N64, that like the one I have here. In fact, this one is also outfitted with the Nintendo 64 HDMI modifications, so I have the 64DD with HDMI out. Now removing is pretty easy. After unscrewing the bottom there, you can just literally pop away the 64. It only attaches through the bottom there. No extra cables or cords come off of this 64DD. It is completely reliant on this system here. And this will actually turn on without needing a cartridge in the 64 itself, which is kind of interesting. I mean, we're so used to having to have a cartridge in the 64 so it can start up, but this pretty much had its own self-contained setup to where it had its own chips and everything inside, extra memory, so that it could start up without having to rely on a disc. And this also gave the 64 access to the internet. Yeah, isn't that strange to think about? You could buy an entire RandNet startup kit and be online doing several things, whether it was checking message board messages, even buying things on there, which included 64DD games, checking magazines. There was a whole little world that existed for roughly a year on this system online. Now looking at the front of this, Nintendo took a lot of precautions. They have a door here, and it does not open easily. You have two little locking pieces on the sides here that have to be pushed in for this door to even move. And the idea there, of course, is that you have your cartridge that is encased in plastic, and then you have this that is also encased in plastic, so it's very difficult to get at the disc inside. That is easy to push in, but that's only because, of course, it's able to unlock the door. Nintendo went kind of above and beyond to make this as durable as possible when compared to CDs. Now, Nintendo didn't have a lot of plans for the 64DD. Like I said, they had this thing planned out from almost the start of the Nintendo 64 system itself. And outside of even going online, they had plans to do things like have Ocarina of Time actually debut on the system, which they eventually, of course, moved to cartridges, and then they just released it for the 64 because this was just having such a hard time getting done and out to the public. But they had some pretty cool ideas that did actually happen. For example, they released expansion kits on this. You might be wondering what that is. Well, if we take a look at what, by the way, is one of the coolest box arts, because of course Japan got all the really cool ones. If we take a look at F-Zero X right here, this is the Japanese box art for it. Again, looks awesome, right? And you had your cartridge right here. And after you pop that in, if you had the 64DD, you could then pop in the expansion kit, which would add extra tracks and things. It was really a neat idea to essentially do DLC before we had access to be able to download it to our systems. And that way, if there was enough of an expansion to where they could add extra content, but not enough to warrant a sequel, they were able to release this, and the 64DD and the cartridge would work together to give you a bigger experience. Now, as far as I can tell, that was like the only game that did that, at least from what I've seen and I have access to. The other ones I have are all of these Mario Artist games, which I tried, and it's kind of difficult to tell what's going on, mostly because I don't read Japanese, so I have a hard time navigating and figure out what I'm doing. From what I can tell, I have one that's like an actual art setup, kind of like Paint. I have one that was like film, so I'm like making a movie, and then I have one that like I can position figures for drawing as well. But these are like the most common ones you'll see. The other one I had that I did play a bit of and had some fun with was Doshin the Giant. And this game, it's strange, yes, and eventually we did get Doshin the Giant on the GameCube in Japan, which is probably where most people would even try it out with, rather than get a 64DD to attempt it. But this is kind of a neat game. I don't know, you play as a giant, you walk around, you drop trees and stuff, and try to help out the villagers who are building things out, and they'll give you hearts, and you get larger after you get so many hearts, you essentially level up. Yeah, it was kind of a fun game. It wasn't too difficult to figure out what was going on after you get the hang of it, and you know what? I think that could be a cool thing to bring back and maybe even drop on like Nintendo's online service if they ever get to the point where they're doing 64 games, of course. The other really cool thing about this is there is an entire project around the 64DD which involves people actually taking these games and converting them over to work on your EverDrive for the 64. So while you may not have a 64DD, you can actually download these and play them in emulators or even on your 64 from what I've been able to gather. So that is pretty cool to preserve these in that way, because to find a 64 DD and these games can be very difficult and expensive. So it's good to see that more people can try these out without having to spend an arm and a leg. All right, now let's go ahead and take this guy apart. So it's pretty straightforward actually to get this open. There's not a lot going on. If we flip it over, we can see there's a couple of screws here, and then we have some up here as well. And that's pretty much all that's holding this thing together. We also have a few clips around the edges that we have to work around. But once we pop those open, the whole top comes off. And we can see when we remove it, we have this very large kind of metal shield right here. Pop that up, because at this point, not a lot of stuff is even screwed in down here to hold these together. There's our locking screws for when we set the 64 DD underneath of the 64. And we have our overall drive right here where these go in. This is currently upside down, so if we take this guy and pop it in there, we can see it kind of load in. We're gonna go ahead and remove this so we can take a closer look. But it's actually a pretty cool setup here in order to get this guy to load in correctly. A lot of things have to work together and then also work together to kick it back out. So a lot of stuff going on in there. But here's the interesting thing. This does also have a real-time clock, and that's why we have our little CR2032 battery down here. But we can actually go ahead and pop this guy out here. There's nothing screwed in, by the way, for this. It's resting on these rubber washers and stoppers to stop any kind of vibration. Also, this is kind of like this rubber guard here. I assume they made it rubber kind of around where you pop the disc in, so that if you're trying to pop it in, you won't scratch up the cartridges. So there was a lot of thought that went into this, by the way, whereas like Sony just threw their system out there and you had CDs laying upside down all over a kid's room. Nintendo really took it seriously for the idea of their stuff being very durable and essentially kid-proof, I guess. Anyway, these just lift right out. So there are no screws holding this guy down like at all. And once you pop this up, we do have some ribbon cables on the back that we have to be pretty careful with. It just has two. So if we kind of lift this guy up, you can see them right here. We just have to be careful to go ahead and pop these out. And now we can take a nice look at the drive here. This is right side up. So if we kind of pop the guy in here, we can see everything kind of working together there to make this happen. If we take this shield off, I can probably get a better look at it. So here we are with the whole top here. We're gonna be pretty careful because this is where we're getting into the setup where we have a lot of parts that have to move in order to make this work. And it might be pretty difficult to reset if we mess this up. And essentially the idea here is as you pop this in, you have an arm that will take this piece right here. It'll push it in and that'll move so that you have the disc exposed there along with the spindle here so we can spin it. You have a motor inside, and the idea is we have two different cables, right? We have one that's for the arm that actually reads from the disc here, and then we have this guy that is designed to spin. So that's all we really need to make this happen, right? And once we pop that in, you'll get a better idea of what I mean. So this goes in. We have an arm that kicks it open. This guy drops down. This is open now, by the way, so that disc is exposed and it will start to read as this spins it. It might be kind of hard to see. I don't know if you can see that. In there, you can actually see the little arm right there. If I pop this in, by the way, it becomes much easier to move because we have the motor free. And you can kind of see the arm. It looks like a little triangle almost in there. And that would allow us to read the disc. We want to be very careful so it doesn't scratch it, but it's a pretty cool setup. You don't see these very often, obviously, like at all, when it comes to game systems of this era. It was just Nintendo being Nintendo, trying to figure out a way to deliver, it's essentially a disc-based system without having a disc-based system's big flaw, which is how delicate the discs are. Okay, back to the main system itself. We have what kind of feels like almost just like an aluminum tape sort of on top here. It's just kind of resting on top, and we just have to unscrew a few of these. All right, so there we go. We have our little cover there off. And here's the system. The system itself isn't anything too crazy. It really isn't. This, by the way, we have two screws here, and the idea of these screws is to help reinforce the slot on the bottom where it does plug in. This will come right up, and that, of course, is where your 64 kind of sits on there and plugs in. LED up top here, pretty much by itself also. I almost wonder if that's basically the same way you would change out the LED if you would like to, like how you do with the 64, which the 64 LED is very easy to change out, but I have a feeling you start changing LEDs in the 64 DD and it'll probably be frowned upon by the collectors community, although then you would definitely have probably one of the most unique pieces ever in a 64 library, a 64DD with like a blue LED. Now the board itself is actually pretty simple if you consider how big the 64DD is, and we have several different chips here with processor, has RAM, has the ability of course to process data from the disk. It's also able to process data when it goes online. This is able to do quite a bit compared to even the 64 itself. I mean, it could turn on without any need of a cartridge being popped in as well. So there's not a ton happening here, but it's enough at the time to add quite a bit of functionality actually to the 64, especially when you bring in the idea of the 64 working together with the 64DD. I think Nintendo was onto something here, and it's kind of a shame that this was not ready to go at launch for the 64 because it is very ambitious, the ideas that Nintendo had around this. I almost wish that Nintendo had gone with this over the 64 cartridges, like this was just part of the 64. I would have been really curious to see what Nintendo would have done there, considering then 64 megabyte cartridges would have been super easy to go with, and we would have had to deal with, I'll say, minimal loading time. And ladies and gentlemen, that's gonna do it here for the 64DD. It's a very ambitious idea from Nintendo that unfortunately did not work out. It failed spectacularly, right? Lasting just over a year to a year and a half with just 10 games released for it. But it does make you wonder even further, as we've talked about how, hey, what if Nintendo went the CD route like Sony? What if they had just gone halfway and done something like this instead of cartridges for the 64, where a 64 megabyte setup here would have been much more common for developers and publishers. And who knows, maybe they would have eventually evolved the technology and worked up to what zip drives were doing, which is just over 100 megabytes at the time. Maybe Square wouldn't have left so abruptly and gone to Sony with their PlayStation 1. Something to think about there. What if instead of the 64 having a cartridge slot on the top, what if it had this kind of slot on the front and you just pop these 64DD discs right in? Let me know what you guys think about this though down below. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.